excited to be able to talk with you. I am a huge fan of yourself, Adam Back, Greg Maxwell, many others there that started Blockstream. So I'm really excited to dig into the engineering and talk to you today.
Thanks for having me, Preston. But one disclaimer, I'm also not an engineer. I'm a game developer and I've done web development, but I'm more of a product person wearing product and business hats.
Well, I'm pretty sure at the end of this conversation, people are not going to buy that. So here's what I want to do. I want to start off and I want to hear the story of Blockstream in the founding days when Adam was standing it up, the other key and instrumental people that were there. What time frame are we talking? And most importantly, what was kind of the mission of Blockstream when you guys first started it?
Yeah, so Blockstream was officially founded in 2014, but I think the gestation of it happened probably a year or two earlier than that, just on the Bitcoin Talk forums where Adam and Greg Maxwell, he was the founding CTO, like they started talking about things like sidechains and how you could scale Bitcoin using this technology. And the founding team was largely Bitcoin developers. A lot of them have since moved on to join sister or related companies like Chaincode. They do a lot of R&D. Basis of Blockstream is really to advance sidechain technologies and to scale Bitcoin. And I would say our company focus is very much privacy centric. Like we want to enhance privacy for everybody and make Bitcoin more robust. So you can also say we try to augment Bitcoin. So a lot of the projects that we undertake, you've listed it in your agenda, like satellites, wallets, explorers, all these things help to make Bitcoin more anti-fragile.
So when Adam and Greg were standing it up, they went out and they started pitching to people out in Silicon Valley to raise money, I'm assuming. I just really don't know any of that history. How long did they go through that process? What kind of funding did they secure kind of in those initial rounds? I'm just kind of curious of the size and then how many people were brought in.
Right. So I think the first seed round was 14 million, and then we raised another 50 some odd million, and the total amount of funding right now stands about 91 million. But I think for that time, it was a massive injection in capital in backing Bitcoin development, a time where there was really no support of Bitcoin development. I think MIT was just starting to support some developers like Corfields and others. Chaincode was not stood up yet, but it was a very different era back then. And I think some of our investors are really actually hardcore Bitcoiners, but they don't get a lot of airtime on that front. So Reid Hoffman, he was a large seed investor in Blockstream, and he likes Bitcoin. He's a strong believer in Bitcoin, but he doesn't get out that much to talk and advocate for Bitcoin like, say, Michael Saylor does. But a lot of the companies backing us do have a strong belief in this technology and where it can take us.
That's the one guy that I was going to bring up because when I was reading up on Blockstream in the beginning and I saw Reid was one of the seed investors, is he still taking an active part in really kind of understanding the direction, the strategic direction of where you guys are going? Because you're right, he does not talk about this a lot. He's on CNBC all the time. I don't ever really see him talking about it very much. It surprises me.
Yeah, but he's written a few blog posts, and one of his blog posts, I believe, is hosted on our Blockstream.com site. It's just explaining why he invested in Blockstream early on and what he believes that we can do. But, he still is involved. He sits on our board of directors. He's also on the board of Microsoft and a number of other companies. And I think it'd be cool if he went out the Michael Saylor style and started doing a lot of podcasts talking about Bitcoin and advocating for Blockstream too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know why he isn't more vocal about it, but based on his investment and the fact that he's sitting on the board there, obviously demonstrates. And I mean, this is a guy who's titan in Silicon Valley, as far as I'm concerned. It's hard to find a bigger name than Reid's. So fascinating stuff. So one of the things that when I look back at the first big monumental shift where I saw Blockstream and many others, I'm not just saying it's Blockstream, many others kind of came to the table, was the 2017 fork. People that I find this fascinating on Twitter, I think very few people, especially the people that have just come into the space in the last 2 years, I don't think they understand any of this background from the 2017 fork. So for the people that have been in the space for a while, this might be a little slow pace for us to talk about this, but I think it's really important for people that aren't familiar with what we're talking about for you to give a little bit of a history on it. And then we can get into the nuances of the engineering behind what's taking place since that and how exciting some of this stuff is. So explain to them what happened in 2017. And I mean, get into all the nitty gritty detail.
All right, so I guess that episode of Bitcoin's history, it goes by a few names. There's the scaling debate, the fork wars, the Bitcoin civil war. I mean, which one do you think is a more suitable
All of them, all the
moniker?
above, yeah.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting time, and I think it culminated in 2017, or maybe, yeah, I think culminated in 2017, but it started, the genesis was in probably even earlier. So Pete Rizzo and Aaron Van Werdum recently released a post about P2SH and that little mini war. That, I think that was the beginning of the schism, where Gavin Andresen and other developers started beginning this little conflict. And I think it heated up when Mike Hearn and Gavin tried to push Bitcoin XT as an upgrade. And that was probably mid to late 2015. And the idea behind that, I think, is largely them trying to get rid of the other developers based on disagreements and not seeing eye to eye. And Gavin's often presented as a very good developer, but that I don't believe is actually the case. And that is a source of that friction between him and the other developers. So the beginning of this, the genesis, is really an effort to fork off Bitcoin and tell everyone that we're upgrading. So I forgot if it was Gavin or Mike. One of them contacted me back then. I was the CEO of BTC China, or BTCC, which was one of the largest exchanges and mining pools. And they were contacting me because they said, we're upgrading now. It's time for you to upgrade to Bitcoin XT, and this is supported by all the developers. And at the time, the channels of communication, people being accessible and making their opinions heard, it was very, very different from what you see today. Everyone is vocal. They're on Twitter. Adam is out there. He's got 200,000 so on followers. But back then, there was no Bitcoin Twitter or even crypto Twitter. Discussions for Bitcoin development were largely on the mailing list and in IRC. And I think the general populace just had a very poor understanding of everything that was going on. And it opened the door for them to try to throw this upgrade up there, or quote unquote upgrade, and say, this is it.
And this upgrade that you're referring to is all about being able to do more transactions, right, per block. That's what this whole thing was about. Everyone was looking at it and they're saying, well, how's this thing going to scale? Because I might get this number wrong. What's the number that Bitcoin can do per second?
7 to 10.
7 to 10. And then when you look at Visa and MasterCard, it's like tens of thousands, like 20 or 30,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, something like that. Upwards of tens of thousands, 20s of thousands.
So people were looking at this and saying, all right, well, this clearly isn't going to work long term because it can't scale for the number of transactions that are going to be needed if this tries to take on a global presence. All the engineers that have been involved to date were like, how do we solve this? And so Gavin, who you were talking about, was coming with, what did you say the upgrade that he was calling it?
Bitcoin XT.
Bitcoin XT. So you're working in a mining pool and you're saying, what in the world is this?
Yeah, and well, there's two ways you can look at that. The optimistic way is that these guys wanted to scale Bitcoin, and they're coming out with the best of intentions that they want higher TPS, and they want to scale it to the point where 1 billion people could use Bitcoin on-chain transactions for pennies on the dollar. And then the more nuanced approach is it was a power play because of this struggle with the other developers, because of disagreements and possibly their lack of ability. And then the even more darker way is this was the first attempt to co-opt Bitcoin, to centralize it, to basically hard fork it and exert control over it at the protocol level. Because once you do that, then there is really no going back. You set yourselves down this path where you can upgrade it at any time. And then you kind of become like Ethereum, which is, willy-nilly upgrades. Anybody can change a number and it's largely meaningless. There is no immutability.
And just for the non-technical folks that are listening to this, when you try to put that many transactions into one block, the problem that pops out of this is it requires a huge amount of hard drive space for anybody running a full node. Because you have such a massive amount of hard drive space required to run a full node, you're pretty much pushing into servers, and only a few people can run the servers, and it becomes centralized, and then those few people that are running the servers basically control any and all updates that happen in the future. So there's this trade-off that Samson's getting, that he's describing here, where if you keep the block small so that anybody and everybody can run a full node, the whole protocol continues to be decentralized and no one can take it over. But the problem with doing that is you keep these small transaction size, 5 or 6 transactions per second, which clearly doesn't work long term. So talk to us about how the solution that ultimately took place, how did all that unravel?
It's a very long story. There were several different upgrades that came out, quote unquote upgrades that came out, and there were sides lines were drawn in the sand of who was a big blocker and small blocker. So there's this division of people that wanted to block small because, as you were saying, it is important. And I think even today, I don't think people fully understand the importance of why you want anybody to be able to sync up a full node. Because once you become a centralized service, you can't really decentralize yourself, right? If every Bitcoin node is in a server farm, well, that's really no different than the legacy financial system where you trust the bank. You ask the bank, how much money do I have? The bank tells you, you've got $1,000. That's it. End of discussion.
Whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah, whether it's right or wrong. This was like an ongoing conflict. And once Bitcoin XT failed to get traction, another one came out, Bitcoin Classic, Bitcoin Unlimited, and then SegWit 2x. But all of these were efforts to change the block size and change the protocol and change things that were already set. A common theme during this era was the Bitcoin developers and Blockstream by extension, because Blockstream often gets conflated in all of these arguments with Bitcoin development, because there were a lot of developers, Bitcoin core developers at Blockstream. But the argument was like, you guys don't want to compromise. But it wasn't really the point. Like that was never the case. You can't really say the developers don't want to compromise, because as we learned at the end, at the culmination of the scaling civil war, it's the users that matter. So this was kind of a false argument saying those guys, those developers, they want to control the protocol. They don't want to increase the size. They don't care about people living in third world countries being able to transact for free. It's all their fault. But at the end, we had lots of companies band together into this big alliance. Coinbase, BitGo, a number of companies under DCG, and they formed this coalition that was pushing SegWit 2x.
I just want to provide my point of view from 2017, because the argument that people didn't want the transactions to be able to occur for all the unbanked, really kind of the Roger Ver argument, right? That's a strong argument, but what I think it fails to do, it's putting the priorities out of whack. Like they had their priorities not in the correct order. And from my vantage point, the number one priority is having a fixed number of units inside the protocol that cannot be manipulated, and it has to be decentralized, right? Like that is priority number one, because if you don't do that vital thing, you're not fixing the problem, because the problem is that we don't have a peg for any currency in the world right now. And so we have to get that perfect. We cannot even have a blemish on that particular mission. And then anything else that we can do on top of that as a second tier spin-off, right, as far as transactions to the unbanked and all that kind of stuff, like that's the icing on the cake. As far as I'm concerned, and it seems like the market agreed and went in that direction. But, a lot of people listening to this might say, well, I don't understand why one thing was more important than the other. But I can see by the way you're nodding your head, you completely agree. It seems like everybody else there, Blockstream, agreed, right?
It's about the evolution of money. I think it's commonly accepted. Nick Szabo has written a lot of papers about this. Money is first evolved as a collectible, then it becomes a store of value. Then you have the medium of exchange phase, and then unit of account. And I think you're mentioning Roger Ver, like he's argued very publicly that it needs to be the medium of exchange first and the store of value second. Common sense dictates that that's not the case. Like you could use anything as a medium of exchange, but it won't necessarily be a store of value. And as an example, you can look at the hyperinflating currencies of some failing countries, right? Like the Venezuelan bolivar, like that's a great medium of exchange. Everyone in the country uses it, but it's not a store of value, and you can't go backwards.
When I was coming to Bitcoin because I was coming out of this finance background. I was looking at what was happening in the bond market. And I was looking at this 80-year treasury curve and saying, this is a disaster. Like this is being completely manipulated and we're going to zero. And then after it goes to zero, people are going to be taking cash out of their bank account and putting it into underneath of their bed, because that's going to give them a better return than a negative interest rate. And so when I was looking at it from that lens, from the finance lens, I was like, we've got to fix the money, we don't have issues with going to Starbucks and paying. Like that's not the fundamental issue here. The fundamental issue is we've got this race to debase. And man, what an important step for Bitcoin at this particular point in time back in 2017. Having not known anything that the research that I know now versus back in 2017, I was very concerned with this fork. And once I learned, this is going to sound really basic for a guy like you, but when I learned that when the fork was going to occur, that I was going to get both coins, it was kind of like, okay, well, there's no risk here. Like, I'm just going to let the market decide which one is right. And then it's not really kind of a risk to me. And I think that's a really important point for people coming into the space for the first time. They might hear like, oh my God, they can fork the code. Well, what does that mean? But you get both coins in the fork, and then you just let the market decide on which one is going to win, right? And we all know which one won. But